As many of you know, recently there's been a lot of media attention about Black outmigration from the city. And as these reports, as these articles, as this conversation started bubbling up about a year ago, we sat around the conference room in our office and wondered what's really going on. A lot of the headlines had mentioned things like interpersonal violence or said that everybody was moving back to Atlanta. And we wanted to know what really were the overall population trends. Do they vary by neighborhood? Are people leaving uniformly? Where are they going? And that led us into venturing into what we initially thought might just be a quick policy brief or a short report, and has expanded somewhat. Given the complex and intersecting dynamics that affect where people settle, as I said, this is not intended to provide a definitive answer as to whether Black residents are being pushed out of the city or moving elsewhere to pursue opportunity, but we're trying to inform the conversation and encourage more conversation. I'll summarize a few of the big findings and then show you a few pieces of data. All of the data I'm showing you here today are in your report, so if you're wondering why I'm moving quickly and want to stare at the tables much longer, they're all in front of you. So please come grab us afterwards also if you want to talk more. So first, we contextualize the recent population changes by placing current patterns within a longer historical context of shifts that have been taking place really over the last 100 years in the city. Taking this long view helps us to see that the more recent patterns are part of a long and evolving history. From this vantage point, we find that the Black population trends in Chicago are associated with trends in levels of racial inequality, as indicated in the report by disparities in unemployment and wages as just a couple of different markers. When inequality in Chicago was lower than many southern cities during the mid-20th century, Black folks migrated to Chicago in high numbers. After 1980, however, racial inequality in Chicago became worse, both compared to historic levels in Chicago and in relation to other cities. At this point, Chicago's Black population started to decline. Viewing these population dynamics over the past century allows us to see how inequities built into the fabric of Chicago during and after the Great Migration, particularly the segregation of Black residents to the Black Belt and the subsequent economic disinvestment from these communities, had enduring effects that would surface more prominently in the 1980s and beyond. While the contemporary exodus of Chicago's Black residents is driven in part by the ongoing consequences of this long history of injustices, it is also driven by current ongoing policy decisions that negatively affect Black Chicagoans. Second, we zoom in to provide a more detailed analysis of population change across neighborhoods over the last 25 years, the dates for which data are available. Here we find major variation across areas of the city with unique local dynamics. As we all know, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, and the trends look different across neighborhoods. Comparing changes across race, we find that Black and white population growth are often inversely correlated. Neighborhoods that have had an increase in white population have generally had a decrease in Black population, while areas with an increase in Black residents have had a decline in white residents. Highlighting neighborhood trends sheds light on the complexity factors contributing to citywide population trends, policies that take into consideration the specificity of local neighborhood histories and conditions will be best positioned to improve the well-being of all of those who call Chicago home, and I will give you some examples. And third, we examine where exactly Chicagoans are going. Our analysis reveals, and this was in some ways the biggest surprise for us when we looked at the data, that most folks are not actually moving very far. While whites are more likely to move to the northern suburbs and Lake County, Black movers are more likely to relocate to southern suburbs, but what you will see from the data in a minute is a majority of folks are actually still in the metropolitan area. And these trends indicate that many of those who leave Chicago remained anchored to the region. I'm going to move quickly through a few of the key patterns, but I want to say one note about categories. Anytime we're doing this work, we are using and navigating through racial categories that we always feel deeply ambivalent about. Our use of racial categories throughout this report is intended to shed light on how racial inequalities emerge and their consequences for social life. One way we identify such patterns is through the analytical comparison of Black and white Chicago residents in various outcomes. Obviously, there are significant population shifts with regard to the Latinx community, which you'll actually see in the tables. And we've discussed these in several previous reports. One, the Latino Neighborhoods Report that we did with the Great Cities Institute, and the other, the Tale of Three Cities, which we published a couple of years ago. Here, our approach is mostly focused on juxtaposing the current trends for Black and white Chicagoans. This is not intended to reaffirm the Black-white racial binary often used to characterize U.S. race relations. They are far more complex than that. At the same time, the creation and evolution of racial hierarchies have always been relational processes that simultaneously benefit some to the detriment of others. Whites have generally benefited from the very same systems of racial hierarchy, both nationally and locally, that have harmed Blacks. By highlighting disparities between Black and white Chicago residents, we hope to inform policy that may actually serve to reduce racial inequity, as well as provide a foundation for further research. Okay, let's look at a few tables. So these are the overall population trends, and what we see here is a Chicago that expanded rapidly during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and has begun to shrink, although leveled off in the last few decades. And you can see that there has been a major decline in population for both Blacks and whites, really beginning in 1980. We see that segregation in Chicago remains pervasive. You can see in these maps the early formation of segregated black belts in areas that we now often refer to as Bronzeville. While that area has expanded, Blacks remain hyper-segregated throughout the city of Chicago. When we look at population change across decades, again, the thing we really want to note here is that the trends that we've been talking a lot about, there's been a lot of attention on what's happened over the last 10 years. These trends really started in 1980. That's when we start to see Black population decline throughout the city, and that the decade of the largest decline was actually between 2000 and 2010. It has not been, the population decline has slowed dramatically more recently. As I indicated before, for us, we see lots of correlation between these population trends and various indicators of racial equity. So this is one indicator. If we look at unemployment rates, you can see that they were relatively low during periods in which Black folks were moving to the city. They're much higher now. Again, this is not a causal argument, but it's worth paying attention to the relationship between these things. Another way of looking at it is thinking about the way the city has changed, the way the employment sector has changed in the city, shifts away from manufacturing, and what it has meant for different kind of occupational sectors in the city. And here, when we look at the percent of Black and white Chicagoans employed in well-paying service industries, we see major differentials across groups. Again, just one final economic indicator is looking at Black and white wage gaps in Chicago. We don't have data for 1970, which is why you see this break. The top line is equity, so what we would really like to see is those slopes all the way up at the top. And what you see here is that we were moving towards equity through the 1960s and have been in decline since 1980. Okay, and very briefly here, you can see this comparison. As I said, the places that people often think folks are moving to back to the South, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were relatively a place of opportunity for Black folks up in that period, and since then the trend has reversed. If we look at net population change by community, one of the questions I get often is this story of gentrification? And the brief answer is mostly no, at least not for Black communities. These are just, in your reports, you can see this data for every community in Chicago. I wanted to focus on a few. If we look at the South Side, what we mostly see is a story about population decline in neighborhoods that have experienced really pervasive disinvestment for a long time. If we look at neighborhoods on the west and north side of the city, we see really different trends. You see neighborhoods like the near North Side and West Town that really are stories of gentrification in a lot of ways. When we look at neighborhoods like Belmont Cragen, Chicago Lawn, again, it's worth paying attention to how different neighborhoods are changing, in part because trying to understand what's happening in them is quite different. For instance, you cannot understand the population changes in the near North Side without thinking about the plan for transformation and the dismantling of the Cabrini-Green housing and replacement of that with market-rate housing and that sort of thing. Okay, two other quick points and then I will turn it over to our panel. This is where we look at where people have gone. This is a map that's really worth looking at that tells us a little bit about different places that people have landed, but I want to show you just two tables that, again, were for us the biggest surprise in some ways when we started doing this work, which is where are people going? And for the most part, people are leaving Chicago and going to Illinois or Indiana. A few are landing in Wisconsin, you can see, and the same is true for white movers. Again, people are not moving very far. When we look at cities instead of looking at states, you have to go all the way down to number 7 for black folks to get anywhere outside the Chicago metropolitan area. For white movers, it's all the way down to number 9. Most folks are staying close by. They are anchored to this region for one reason or another. And so while we do want to think seriously about why Chicago has become less hospitable, we also need to recognize that people are staying close. Okay. My comments today by offering a couple of thoughts from Mary Patillo's essay, which came at the end of the report, as a good transition to hearing from the rest of our expert commentators. As she writes about in her essay, calling for a black Chicago revival. Oops, sorry. She says, there is a deep and painful irony to current trends. The rationale for insisting on what she says, again, is a black Chicago revival is to counter the important finding of this report that black and white population growth are inversely correlated. This is a repeated story of black migration, of arriving a day late and $1 short. Black folks arrived in northern cities in the second wave of the Great Migration, just as urban deindustrialization was dawning. Factories were falling apart after wartime production and looking to rebuild anew in the suburbs and overseas. Accordingly, white suburbanization took off in the 1950s, while black suburbanization lagged more than 20 years, picking up just as the suburban housing stock was aging, and the inner ring suburbs in particular were shedding jobs. Now white people are moving back to the city and black people are moving out. It has not just happened that black people's moves have been too late to take advantage of the most plentiful opportunities and investments. Instead, black people were systematically excluded from advantageous places until they pushed their way in. Once they did, white people supported by politicians, employers, real estate professionals, and others often took their spoils and moved elsewhere. Calling for a black Chicago revival is about standing our ground as the city becomes prime real estate again. It is about recognizing these racist cycles of possession and dispossession, hoarding and exclusion, exodus and return, and intervening through black creativity, demand, and rootedness. Thank her and thank all of you, and we are going to start at this end with Stacey Sutton. Sorry, and go that way. Yes, you're here. And like I said, we will have the panelists just say their name as they come up, but their bios are all in the program, and we encourage you to look at them as you're listening. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Thanks for coming, and sorry I'm a little late. So I am Stacey Sutton. I'm a professor of urban planning and policy here. And I contributed one of the essays because while I think about migrations and different forms of mobilities, I was particularly perplexed by what we're seeing in Chicago, but moreover, what we've been hearing about, this black exodus, as I call it, right? And since I moved here in 2015, it's been kind of part of popular discourse that blacks are leaving Chicago. More and more blacks are leaving Chicago. And then when you look at the numbers, as the report shows, that blacks are still leaving Chicago, meaning that although the public discourse seems to be heightened currently, this has been a long-term trend, right? So then that raised a question for me in terms of why are we spending so much time talking about this now? Is there something particular about this this moment in terms of migration? And I unfortunately can't answer that question. But I want to put it out there as a really provocative question, right? But the report does a few things that I think are really important. So I want to just thank IRPP for, one, aggregating this information, right? There's been a lot of disparate information out there. It's been aggregated, and it's now a document. It's going to be archived. We have this information in one place, and that's really important. And there's also a finding that they offer in terms of people are moving to areas that are less segregated. There's less inequality. I thought that was really interesting. However, as a social scientist, I don't think people think about, well, what's the index of dissimilarity in this city? Maybe I'll move there. I might do that, but I don't think most people think about that, right? It just so happens. So that tells us a lot about Chicago and the level of inequality in Chicago. And the reasons that I think people are moving, something that we didn't, that's spoken about or written about within this document in different places, interspersed within different places, but I think it's really important to highlight. I think people are moving from Chicago because Chicago's becoming untenable in terms of living. I know that seems obvious, right? People are deeply and profoundly connected and attached to Chicago. Chicagoans love Chicago. So what pushes people away from their home, whether it's Chicago or whether it's Senegal or whether it's somewhere in, I don't know now, I'm not thinking of other cities. There's only like 1 million that I can't think of. But the point is, people move and leave home because they can no longer stay in that place. And so that's where my research comes in terms of, I think about punitive cities. Cities that use policy and practice in a way that makes it untenable, impossible for people to remain in place. And there's a myriad of possibilities or a myriad of policies that we can point to. And so some of the things I just mentioned in this piece, one of the things Chicago has done, and to combat the stigma of urban decline and disinvestment since the 1990s, Chicago has led the way and it has embraced these what I call low road development practices, right? And categorically adopted kind of market-based investment in the public sphere, meaning privatizing our roads, privatizing our parking spaces, privatizing tickets in terms of receiving tickets, so many mechanisms, privatizing public housing, right? So many of the mechanisms that were part of the public sphere that allowed people to remain in place, that either weren't punitive or they were actually supportive, have been eroded. So I think that's huge, because when you look at the demographic that's leaving, not only are they black, they're low income. They're working class black folks that are leaving because they can't afford to stay. And so when we use certain measures of gentrification, for instance, it might suggest, oh, these neighborhoods aren't gentrifying. Well, I think if you ask residents on the South Side in Woodlawn, they will say they can't afford to stay. It might not meet the measure of gentrification that we're talking about, but they can't afford to stay. When I asked my Lyft driver, because I do research on tickets, and not just the tickets that we know that there's police bias, I actually look at tickets from the cameras, the automated cameras. So we shouldn't see any racial difference when you're looking at automated cameras. It's a huge racial difference, huge. The report's not out yet, it's coming soon. So when I asked my Lyft driver how many tickets he received last year, he received $1,800 worth of tickets, right? And if he didn't pay them, he would lose his license for driving Lyft because Chicago has scofflaws. If you owe the city money, you can't work for the city, you can't work for Lyft, you can't work for any of the rideshares. There are a set of policies that are punitive. You can lose your car so you can't get to work again and again and again, right? So when you think about that, people have to leave because they can't stay, they can't work. they can't pay their tickets, and then they can't get to work. So, it's this vicious cycle. And I know we only have a couple minutes, so I won't go on, belabor the point. But I think this report highlights different elements that are really important that we can go deeper on. And so I'm taking the opportunity to go deeper on this notion of the punitive city. How are the policies and practices that we vote for, that we kind of support in different ways, making it impossible for people to stay in this city that we love? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So happy that you are here. And thank you to IRPP again for this wonderful series of reports and for bringing us all together. There's many of you wonderful people who are here. I want to call attention to a couple in particular, which is relevant even to what my comments are going to be. I want to note that the City of Chicago's Commissioner of Housing, Marissa Novato, is here with us. And I wanted to particularly note her because she's also, when she was with MPC, did the report on the cost of segregation. So I think, just want to thank Marissa for coming. And also, I want to also acknowledge that the Executive Director of the Urban League, Sherry Renner, is also here. And thank you also for coming. And want to acknowledge her because of the work that we've done with you all on youth joblessness. Both of these are related to the comments that I want to make. So, again, this is really important data to bring forward and to talk about the changes in the demographics of the city of Chicago, and to note that the Black population is continuing to decline, although it's not as steep as it was between 2000 and 2017. And I'm glad Amanda pointed out, for example, that this was a decade of the plan of transformation was put into effect, and the tearing down of public housing. And in fact, we have also the chair of the board of the National Public Housing Museum here as well, too, Sonny Fisher. So I think there's a lot of you here who are doing work that's very relevant. So I think it's very exciting that you are all here. What I want to emphasize is first of all, to note that the white population also in Chicago had been in decline until the period between 2000 and 2017. So we've seen a curve downward in the overall decline of Chicago. But what's important about that, I think, and to look at the Black population decline was like a little over 30%, and it's like 33% in that, and from their peak until now. But the white population was just at 30%. But they peaked in 1950. Black population peaked in 1980. But, and this is where I get to the segregation issue, if you look in particular neighborhoods, that decline is substantially higher, upwards of 70–80%. So you can take neighborhoods like Inglewood, West Inglewood, Garfield Park, West Garfield Park, that may have had 110, 113, 100,000 population plus, and that have declined by 70–80%. So I think that the concentrated nature, the segregated nature of this decline, I think is something that's really important to point out. The other thing that's important to point out, I think, and this is something I highlight in my comments, is that the decline, Stacey made the point that it's very much related to people's ability or inability to be able to afford to be able to stay. And so I want to point out that part of that inability to stay not only has to do with rising prices of things, but it has to do with the decline of jobs. And so I think we really need to look at all this decline in the context of this economic refiguration that is followed by spatial reconfiguration that we're seeing not only in the city of Chicago, but in the Rust Belt area in general. So with the decline of manufacturing, for example, you lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. At the height of our manufacturing, we had about 667,000 manufacturing jobs. Now, manufacturing has a much higher multiplier effect than does other economic-based jobs. It's about a 7 times multiplier effect. So you take that 667,000, you multiply that by 7, right? That's the number of jobs that we had in manufacturing. But you look at that in 2014, and the number of manufacturing jobs is only 110. And so you multiply that times 7, and you see this huge drop in manufacturing. And some of the maps that we've done, we've shown, I'm sorry, in case you don't know, I'm director of Great Cities Institute, but some of the jobs, the maps that we showed, shows spatially where manufacturing jobs were in 1960 and 1970, and then where they were in 2000 15 and 2017, I think, or maybe it was 15 that we looked at. And you can see this really stark contrast, right? And the extent to which there was jobs throughout the city of Chicago, and then they emptied out, right? Jobs left these communities, and they left them very quickly, right? So I think people hung on as long as they could, but at a certain point you can't stay if you can't find work. One of the things that we have also done in some of our work at Great Cities, and this is related to my comment about Chicago Urban League, is we produced for a number of organizations, including the Urban League, but an Alternative Schools Network, a series of reports on joblessness. And we didn't look at unemployment, we looked at joblessness, which is a different rate. So those unemployment rates that you saw that Amanda put up, those itself were really bad. But when you look at joblessness, it's a different calculation and it's a different rate. So what's the difference? The unemployment rates are usually Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? And they calculate those people who are actively looking for jobs. They may be out of work, but they're actively looking. The joblessness is the reverse of an employment population ratio. And what you find when you look at that is the actual number of people in a given population. You take that as the base, and then you look at you take the number of people who are employed. And then you find out that in these same neighborhoods where the manufacturing jobs left, where there's concentrations of segregated populations and primarily black population is what I'm referring to, that the numbers of joblessness is extraordinarily high. And so part of the point there is there has been an enduring impact of this reconfiguration, of this economic restructuring, and we're still feeling the impacts of the decline in manufacturing. So the real question then becomes, as the economy has been changing and continues to change, how are we going to build an inclusive economy? So we really need to rebuild our neighborhoods, but we're going to have to rebuild our neighborhoods right in ways that give people opportunities to be able to be employed. And so this focus on job training, money back into education, and providing people the opportunities to be able to have access to employment is part of what will enable them to stay. So thank you very much and look forward to more conversation.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Lee, and I'm the director of the National Public Housing Museum, and I want to talk a little bit about the relationship of housing to this important topic, and to really thank IRPP for including housing as a lens for understanding the issue of migration. When Daniel Burnham was almost finished with the 1909 Plan of Chicago, he visited the well-known social reformer and peace activist Jane Addams at the Hull House Settlement, now the Jane Addams Hull House Museum and a part of the UIC campus. Burnham traversed to the west side in what was at that time the heart of Chicago's working class and immigrant populations, and also the place of the most overcrowded and dangerous tenements, to ask the single unanswered question about his perfectly laid out city. Where do the poor people live? There were absolutely no provisions for housing, absolutely none in this ambitious effort to make no little plans. His effort to reimagine a rapidly growing city was, after all, a proposal to beautify and improve efficiency in business and economic enterprises. In 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority launched an even more ambitious effort called the Plan for Transformation, with a massive $1.6 billion budget funded for the most part by the federal government's HOPE 6 program, an acronym for Home Ownership Opportunities for People Everywhere. The plan proposed a fundamentally new approach to public housing in Chicago. One of the first actions was the bulldozing of 11 high-rise public housing developments that, when demolished, represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. Say their names: Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens, Ida B. Wells Homes, Jane Addams Homes, Harold Ickes Homes, Grace Abbott Homes, Henry Horner Homes, Randolph Towers, Loomis Courts, Cabrini Green. These names conjure feelings and thoughts in the popular imagination, usually not of the vibrant communities that live there, nor the people who formed imaginative and complex networks of support and long-lasting friendships, but of stereotypes of what it means to be poor and Black in America. Due to a long, deeply racialized history, public housing and the people who live there have been regarded with deep suspicion and resentment. In the prevailing ahistorical narrative, public housing is a failed social policy. However, a brief history reveals that the National Housing Act of 1937 helped to build subsidized housing for millions of working-class Americans devastated by the Great Depression, and that at one point, the U.S. government's mandate was to provide a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family, the exact words in the National Housing Act of 1949. If we listen closely to the voices and stories of public housing residents and scholars like Roberta Feldman, Rhonda Williams, Richard Rothstein, Mary Patilla, and Kanga Yamada Taylor, we hear counter-narratives, and we are able to hear the histories of fierce women's leadership, of innovative entrepreneurship, of care and generosity and resilience and resistance, and be able to analyze the histories of systemic racism and economic injustice that informed the failed public housing policies. This includes police acting with impunity, chronic disinvestment, and crumbling and unsafe buildings due to deferred maintenance. Explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels worked to ensure segregation, and ruthless policies of redlining, racially exclusionary mortgages, and then racially predatory housing policies, and inequities around education, health, labor, and policing all contributed to the creation of an almost exclusively African American population in public housing in Chicago and in most cities in the U.S. It is true that the Plan for Transformation sought to deliberately disrupt entrenched patterns of segregation and concentrated poverty and address the crumbling, unsafe buildings. And at the core, it was an ambitious experiment of social engineering called mixed income housing that integrated public housing residents into larger social, economic, and physical fabric of Chicago. It is, however, not so clear why or how the idea of people living in poverty, living next door to people with money, became the ersatz solution instead of actually alleviating and addressing the root causes of poverty. It is clear that by creating mixed income developments and a voucher system for long-term rent subsidy contracts in privately owned developments, the city intentionally shifted much responsibility for housing and management to the private sector, as it was mentioned. Housing as a commodity in a market economy in the private sector versus housing as a right and a basic necessity. These are two notions deeply at odds with one another. The history of public housing is as much about housing as it is about the history of the public, our relationship to the idea of a public good, and the importance of a commonwealth for all of us, where we can all make claims and thrive. The fundamental focus of master plans are usually on places, not the people, certainly not people of color or poor people. These are the people who are all too often in the way of redeveloping places, and so these are the people who become the collateral damage in the urban planning process. Early studies have shown that the plan has devastatingly contributed to the so-called Great Reverse Migration of African Americans, people who are scattered, displaced, forced to migrate, and forced to dislocate from the places they call home. This is a pattern that has been repeated all too often, over and again. As the author James Baldwin once astutely and painfully observed after the urban renewal policies of the 1960s that helped to build the University of Illinois at Chicago, urban renewal means Negro removal. Housing insecurity is one of the most persistent and urgent challenges for the majority of city dwellers. The impact and reverberations of a plan for transformation and the lack of public and affordable housing for anyone and everyone is something that our city and other cities across the country need to vigilantly question, explore, and demand accountability for. Just down the street at 1322 West Taylor, the National Public Housing Museum will soon open in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes. Public housing residents, joined by scholars, activists, preservationists, and many others, believe in the power of place and memory and are working together to create a museum that will be a place to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper, a place to call home. Residents organized to save the building from demolition, and where collectively a large group of stakeholders now believe in the civic institution that can be a site of conscience, a site of resistance against erasure and forgetting, a place to ask critical questions about history and unleash our imaginations for the future and create real solutions to preserve the stories of public housing residents and oral history archive, and to bridge creativity and storytelling with innovative public policy, a place to forge a collective future that is better for all of us, which must be a world where housing is a human right. Thank you so much to IRPP for this opportunity to include housing as a lens, and thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Todd Breland. I'm an associate professor of history here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I did not contribute to the report. I am a historian of African American history, and particularly I focus on the history of race and education here in the city of Chicago. But I did have an opportunity to read early versions of the report, and so my comments today are going to be sort of highlighting some of the things that stood out to me and that I want to sort of weave into some thoughts. So I want to start by saying what I hope is obvious to everyone in this room, and certainly will be to you after you read the report, that Black population loss in the city of Chicago is a problem. It's long in the making, but it's current and ongoing crisis, and we should keep ringing the alarm about it. But I say this because I'm not necessarily convinced that this is a shared sentiment, that Black people leaving the city is necessarily a bad thing. Black communities continue to be defined as places of pathology, as unredeemable, as spaces of deficit. Implicit in this is that our city may be better off with less Black people. Black people are problem people with our problem schools and our problem families and our problem neighborhoods. Even in the reporting, sort of the more frequent reporting on this topic, Black population loss is often commented on as sort of like a naturally occurring event like the weather. Like this migratory pattern is happening, when there's going to be a gust, it's going this way. However, as the report mentions, between 1980 and 2006, the Black population decreased by more than 350,000 people here in the city. As Eve discusses in her essay, this is displacement, not a movement chosen by people with many viable choices. These conditions are not the result of poor choices, in fact. They're conditions created by decades of public policy, racially discriminatory public policies and practices, things that were mentioned, restrictive covenants, redlining, white racial violence, the demolition of public housing, people's homes actually being destroyed, mass incarceration. In 2014, more than 20,000 Black Cook County residents were in prison, not in their homes here in the city. And this is a part of a destabilization of communities. Public policies created with and along with private and corporate interests, too often primarily in service of capital and private profits, rather than in service of the public, and certainly rarely in service of Black folks in the city. Displacement is what happens when home is no longer a viable place for your family to survive. I think that's been mentioned already. One of the pieces of data that I was most struck by was the employment data that's been mentioned. The Black unemployment rate in 2006 was 21.9%, higher than any time on the graph. And the graph started in 1930, which was in the middle of the Great Depression. And as Teresa mentioned, this doesn't even include joblessness, which is a whole other category. And it also doesn't account for current underemployment. So many people are working today, but not at a job or not with enough hours to provide a living wage for themselves and their family. So I think the emphasis on the report on the private sector was important, but I also want to highlight the ways that public sector job loss for African Americans has been particularly acute here in the city of Chicago. African Americans have been historically disproportionately represented in working in the public sector. It is a niche form of employment for Black people, not just here in Chicago, but nationally. And in the same period that we're looking at, you see the decline in Black folks in public sector employment. Black people today then are living with an ongoing economic depression akin to the 1930s. Just sorry to go back to the public sector again. I also want to highlight that in the public sector in particular, in some ways unlike some forms of the private sector, public sector unions help to maintain a higher quality of life and stability within a deindustrializing economy. So even when we looked at that data about Black people in the service sector that are in higher paid jobs, a significant proportion of those, I'm going to guess, are likely in public sector service employment. So this is how displacement happens. The data in the study make clear that white people do not like living near Black people and will do lots to go out of their way not to live near Black people. There's lots of talk about gentrification, and I certainly think that's important, but many black neighborhoods, as been mentioned here, are also suffering from abandonment. And we often call this disinvestment. And I want to think about this idea of disinvestment for a moment, because it's often talked about a lot in reference to black communities in the city. Disinvested communities. And I think it's very true that black communities have been disinvested from the things that people want. Quality public services, jobs, grocery stores, commerce, healthcare, adequately funded schools, affordable housing. But these are also not completely disinvested communities. Public and private investments are being made in black communities, but they're largely investments in things that people don't necessarily want. So predatory mortgages, absentee landlords who profit off of people with limited options, massive public investments in policing, a huge proportion of our city budget. A scholar named Oliwe Rooks calls this segronomics, the idea that lots of people actually profit off of racial segregation, that racial segregation is profitable for many people. In the report, Mary Patillo said, quote, "The reality is that the public and private sectors have greased the wheels of white success. Black demand is about recognizing that centuries-long history and redressing it with investments that benefit Black Chicagoans." She says that Black Chicagoans are owed for the plunder of contract lending, quote, "both in the form of monetary reparations and preferential access to opportunities that enhance wealth and well-being," end quote. The report is very clear in its assertion that racial inequality is causing black displacement here in the city. And so I think that part of our challenge, and I'm not suggesting to have the answer to this per se, but I think it's a big challenge, is that our solutions not be piecemeal, but really be in proportion to the scale of the crisis. There has been massive privatization of the public sphere, as already has been mentioned, a massive debt owed toward black people in Chicago and the US, and undoing this requires massive new investments in communities where black people already live. And Mary calls in her essay for reparations to this end. What is reparations? A righting of past wrongs? A different form of investment? So I want to end by talking about this idea again of investment and thinking of it in a sort of different way. Not so much the transactional kind of investment, but a pouring into. When I read through the essays, one of the things I felt very strongly was a certain amount of like mourning and loss. There was a tone there. And I think that's mourning for the way that black migrants from the South poured into the city in the early 20th century. The way that these new Chicagoans poured into and created communities like Bronzeville, communities on the West Side. The way they created art, created family in a new space that was not necessarily what they were promised, but it was what they made it, home. Black Chicago was and is amazing. As Mary Patillo's essay reminds, we are so much more than the sum of our supposed deficits. Black Chicago is joy. It's laughing and playing at a park with your children. It's the Bud Billiken parade on a hot summer day. It's the ambiance of a Southside tavern. It's a high school reunion at a roller skating rink. It's a family that takes you in and makes you part of their family. It's blues, it's house music, it's footwork. Political scientist Fred Harris calls Chicago, quote, "the political capital of Black America," end quote. Chicago produced disproportionate numbers of black elected officials during the 20th century, and it also, as Barbara reminds us in her essay, created a robust grassroots organizing tradition. So I want to end by saying, as Mary says in her essay, Black Chicago is still here. We may be declining, but we're still here. We're still the second largest black urban population after New York. And we're still here, and we're worth organizing for, and we're worth fighting for. Thank you.
Good morning. So my name is Eve Ewing. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. I want to begin by thanking Amanda and Yvonne and everyone at IRPP for having me, and also to my very esteemed, this is probably the best panel I'll be on this year, and also to acknowledge that we gather this morning on the homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. And through the wisdom of our Indigenous brothers and sisters and Indigenous thinkers, we come to understand that what we refer to as settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So it's not something that happened in 1492, it's something that is happening now, and I think that is intimately related to some of the trends that we're talking about today. So maybe we can get to that a little bit in the Q&A. So I'm very grateful to have been asked to comment on this study, and I think it's important to understand that, first of all, it has profound implications for the culture of our city. When I talk to Black people from other parts of the country, they want to come visit Chicago because they understand this to be what Zandria Robinson and Marcus Anthony Hunter, sociologists, refer to as a chocolate city, right? This is a Black political capital, as Elizabeth just reminded us. But I think it's important for us to also understand that this is part of a national trend in which cities like Philadelphia, cities like Washington, D.C., like Detroit, like Oakland, there are ways in which people are very enamored now with consuming Black culture without the inconvenience of actual Black people. And we know that this is part of the long history of American popular culture, right, that has been going on as long as Black people invented cool, right, is that there are people who want to consume that cool and very much want to consume the cultural cachet of living in a city like Chicago, but don't want to deal with the actual presence of Black people or Black bodies. And so that matters for people like us, people like me who grew up here and who care very much about the culture that Mary and Elizabeth were just talking about and celebrating. But it's also important for us to understand that this is about a canary in a coal mine, to use legal scholar Lonnie Guinier's metaphor, right? That really when we see Black people being systematically displaced from the city, we should be asking ourselves, what are the conditions that have made our city fundamentally unlivable for low-income Black people? And what does that tell us about the type of city we're becoming? What type of city do we want to be? And who deserves to call that city home? I think it's important to remember that the Great Migration, as much as it's a very, in some ways, very romanticized period in history and led to a lot of beautiful and important things, that our ancestors came north because they were fleeing a regime of racial terror, right? People leave their homes because they're fleeing something where they are literally in fear of their lives, where the entire social and political edifice of the society in which they live makes them feel like they have to go. And so if we're going to refer to this as something like a reverse Great Migration, which I think is something we probably shouldn't do for a lot of reasons, but if we're thinking about this kind of exodus, what are people fleeing from, right? And so the answers to that are manifest, right? This is a regime of racial terror in this city that has come to make it fundamentally unlivable. And it is not any one thing, and we can find any number of kind of media reports in the last several years that have pointed to one thing or another. My contention is that this is a regime of things, right, that come together. It is closing public schools, right? It is demolishing public housing. It is having wildly inequitable transit systems in this city. It is the fine and fee system, right, that has made us really comparable to a place like Ferguson in the ways that which the city's budget is actually contingent upon stealing money from the people who have the least money, right? None of these things, even if they don't impact you on an individual level, they come together and cohere to create this kind of fundamental untenability. Boy, I feel like there's always creative new ways of screwing over low-income Black people in the city. When I found out that Black people are more likely to get ticketed for not shoveling, I'm like, the snow is not supposed to see race, right? But the police do, right? The snow is living in a post-racial moment, but the police are not. Biking, Black people are more likely to get tickets for biking, for violating bicycle laws in the city. I'm like, wow, that is just creative. And Candace Coleman from Access Living is here, and the conversation we had before this event began, you know, she was talking about how we don't have alternatives to calling 911 when people are in a mental health crisis. So the mental health issues that are facing the Black community, PTSD, right, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, we know that all these things are troubling our communities actually at greater numbers. We have the least access to mental health care because before they close the schools, they close the mental health clinics, right? And so what do you do when someone in your vicinity is having a crisis and you don't want them to lose their lives like Quintonio LeGrier did or like Betty Jones did, right? Who do you call? So all of these things come together and create what I would consider a racially oppressive regime that makes it fundamentally untenable for people to live here. There's a kind of theoretical intervention I'm trying to work out in my head right now where I think in the 20th century we came to talk very colloquially about the inner city, right? The inner city. The inner city is the place that is geographically central but socially marginalized, right? Now I think we need to start talking about the outer city. What are the ways in which the same folks that have been socially marginalized are now pushed also to the geographic margins? The 14 cities from 2000 to the 2018 that had the largest black populations in 2000, so the places that at the turn of the century, turn of the millennium had the largest black populations, 7 of them, New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, New Orleans, and DC, have all seen notable declines in black residents. And Chicago is number 3 in those declines. So Detroit has lost 32.7% of its black people since 2000. New Orleans has lost 29.03%, and Chicago has lost 25.12%, so about a quarter. Think about the kind of exogenous factors that you see in New Orleans and Detroit, right? So what is our version of Hurricane Katrina? What is our version of the collapse of the automotive industry? Why are we out here rivaling these 2 cities that have had these incredibly newsworthy events? So I'm going to close by making an unapologetic plug, as all researchers do, for the need for more research. So I think that building on the incredible quantitative work that we see in this report, what I'm trying to do with my research team is think about how we can gather some of these stories qualitatively. And so if you are a black person from Chicago who is thinking about moving away, if you have friends or family that have moved away and you want to talk about us, there are flyers, or talk to us about that. There are flyers at the front table. We'll be doing a series of focus groups this February and March. You can also visit beyondschoolslab.org/survey and sign up to talk to us there, or you can call 773-234-3193 and leave us a voicemail. Samantha, are you in the room with flyers? Okay, my project manager, Samantha Christian, is also in the back if you want to get a flyer. And if you represent an organization today, please take one back, because we really want to talk to folks about their experiences. Thank you so much.
Peace and greetings, y'all. My name is Dave Stovall. I am here in the Department of Black Studies. I can say that now. Yeah. And Criminology, Law, and Justice. What I want to say briefly today, first, let me thank the panelists for their unapologetic fearlessness, right? I'm usually used to being the radical one. I might be soft compared to what folks have put out today. So thanks to the homies on the panel. The report, and I really want to structure the report around this framing, and I want to thank IRRPP for doing it. But there's a fundamental question that I begin to ask about the report, that as a black Chicagoan and a lifelong Chicagoan, that I ask: what does it mean to live in a city that is structurally designed to remind you of how much it hates you? Right? So now, if we can ask that particular question, I think the ways in which we approach it become different. I have a 96-year-old uncle who lives up the street. His name is Malone Wilson. He still says his phone number as GB32689. So for older folks who know this, my Uncle Malone predates area codes, right? And that GB means Grand Boulevard, right? Which is the name of the community, right? So there's actually a sign here, there's a meat packing place called Nia Agora that actually still has a sign with those old Chicago phone numbers. So these things around understanding what it means to be a lifelong Chicagoan, when I wrote my section for the report, I thought about a conversation that I had with a cop. Now, for folks who may not know me having a conversation with a cop is probably not a good thing. The way this officer framed Chicago, I think becomes important. And I got in contact with him by way of an old high school basketball teammate. And he said, look, I'm doing some stuff, but I think you need to talk to this guy. He has some insights into how you're approaching things. And when I got a chance to talk to him, he said, yeah, Stovall, I agree with you. I actually like your work. You know, it's always when you hear that from law enforcement, you're like, right, what does that mean, right? He says, but I want you to think about something. And he says, I'm going to tell you how to make a killer. And he said, look, we don't think about this in particular ways. He said, this is what you do. You do not have a place for them to live. You do not have a viable place for them to work. You do not have a viable place for them to go to school. And then you hire me to contain them. with the hope that they will kill themselves within the containment. Right? So now when we think about this, when we think about issues of violence in a city like Chicago, I have to think about that conflict that we often see between young folk as largely being engineered. So if we think about that conflict as being engineered, I can start a fight pretty easily in any big city. All I have to do is close one school and send all the young folks to the rival school. What happens when you do that 50 times in one summer? What happens when you do that 150 times since 2004? What is the expectation? And I think the report pushes us to understand that these historical and empirical data points are now reflective of a history that we cannot run from. And when we can't run from it, the other part that we have to pay attention to, and I think this becomes important, especially to myself as someone as a Chicagoan, is the resistance. Who is resisting? And how are they resisting? What are the terms and conditions of the resistance? And then how are they claiming their humanity in places that are bereft of resources? Give you all one quick data point that wasn't mentioned in the report, but I think is germane to the report. There's an organization called Generation All. Generation All just released a report that Chicago schools, 50% of Chicago schools are at 50% or lower in terms of the capacity for the building. So now when we talk about this particular set of relationships, we have to be clear around where these things take place. And as the panelists pointed out, these concentrated areas are now the spaces that we don't think about just not as disinvested, but abandoned and structurally abandoned, historically abandoned. And now, when we see people like the Let Us Breathe Collective, when we see like organizations like Fearlessly Leading the Youth, when we see organizations like U Medics that are actually going into communities teaching folks how to treat gunshot wounds, now we have to think about that particular fighting spirit moving forward. We are Chicagoans. It's hard to get rid of us. They have tried, but it ain't gonna happen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, or good morning. Wait, I'm the eighth speaker. And I don't know, including Amanda, I'm the eighth speaker, so I know you all are tired or ready to talk. And I don't know who put me after Dave Stovall. They will pay for that. I'm Barbara Ransby, and I teach here at UIC. I direct something called Social Justice Initiative, and I do a lot of organizing. I try to do organizing in the city. I hang out with organizers because they are some of the most important people around. I'm going to do three things in my brief remarks, and my essay was the shortest, so I will probably be the briefest. But I want to do three things. One is that I really do want to linger on my gratitude to IRRPP. Amanda Lewis and Yvonne Arenas, have consistently done the kind of research and presented it in the form that is accessible to audiences beyond the academy, and that is no small feat. To do that is to invite a level of scrutiny and accountability. When you say to community groups, we're going to do this research and we're going to give it to you, right? We're going to partner with you. That means people are going to say, well, what about this? Well, why didn't you do this? Well, I thought you should have said this. It means that you open yourself up to a kind of engagement and a kind of scrutiny that is actually healthy and that most academics insulate themselves from. So I want to celebrate that kind of public intellectual work. We need more of it. We need to be in partnership with people who are not only trying to diagnose the problem, but actually change the situation. And that's the kind of scholarship that IRPP has engaged in. I think when you look at the voices that are in the report, and when you look around this room, it's a very special convening and a very special conversation. So the second thing I'd like to just speak to is the substance of the report. I'm a historian, so between the Great Migration and the growing Black Exodus, covers a 100-year period in that title, right? What a title and what a story it tells. What a set of stories it evokes. Over that 100-year period, many of our great-grandparents and grandparents migrated to Chicago, as other panelists have said, the great urban black mecca of the Midwest. I'm from Detroit, so that's the first urban black mecca of the Midwest, but this is the second urban black mecca of the Midwest. They came fleeing racial terror in the South. They came looking for good jobs, good music, good living, and they found some of that. The city never matched the large and ambitious dreams of our ancestors. In some ways, it didn't come close, but it did become home, a cultural center, a political incubator, and a creative catalyst for the arts. It is a city that produced the artist and activist Margaret Burroughs, the poet Gwendolyn Brooks, the educator Timuel Black. But all around and through that cultural work and that educational work is activism and organizing. That organizers created the space that black art could be produced. Organizers created the space where black communities could be formed. Margaret Burroughs is best known, perhaps, in Chicago as the founder of the DuSable Museum. She is best beloved, where some of us have gone to teach, at Stateville Prison, because she went to Stateville Prison because she said that there are no nobodies in Chicago, and that while you may exile some of our sisters and brothers to places like Stateville Prison, of course, is a maximum security men's prison, she said, while you may exile some of our brothers and sisters, they are still ours, right? We are still community. So there's a way in which we transcend even the boundaries of the city in our claims to community. When I look out at my classroom every semester and I see, young people, very diverse, not enough black students, but we're working on that. But when I look out at my classroom, I not only see who's there, the first generation students from Inglewood, Bronzeville, all over the city, I think of who's not there. And I think about the tens of thousands of incarcerated young people who will never be in our statistics about unemployment or education or anything else, and I think we have to, claim them too. So the migrants who came to Chicago never imagined in their wildest dreams that decades later, that generations later, in the 21st century, that there would be this outward migration, this political exodus, this economic pushing out of black people in this city. But what I want to also say as we talk about and diagnose and map and document this problem of, as people have said, abandonment and exile, that's what we should call it and name it, we have to also remember black agency. Things don't just happen to us. We respond. We create limits, we create synergy, we create resistance, we create survival strategies. So my contribution to the document that you have on your seats today is to talk about some of that and to remind us of the resiliency and the power in places that we often look and see as powerless. Without organizing, John Burge would have never been brought to even a semblance of justice for all the crimes he committed in this city against our people. Without organizing, we would have never had a Harold Washington as mayor. Without organizing, we would not have a trauma center on the south side of Chicago, and the list goes on. So while we diagnose the problem, while we mourn some of what has happened to us, as many of my colleagues up here, and this is, I must say, if I can say, a hella panel, we have diagnosed some problems that should be cause for serious concern. They should be sobering. They should make us angry. But they should also make us tap that spirit of resistance and organizing that is so needed today, that is prevalent today. There's meetings every night in the city, I know, because I'm in half of them. But there are meetings every night of people figuring out how to organize, how to push back, how to reclaim this city, and how to push back against what's happening in this country and the world. And I invite all of you to be a part of that.
All right, well, good morning. It's great to be here. Thanks to IRPP. I'm Alden Lowry, by the way. I'm a journalist. I'm currently working with WBEZ and was asked to be a part of this project because I've done a number of reports as a journalist and as a researcher on the phenomenon, I like to call it, of black people leaving the city of Chicago. There's not really much left to say, I would have to say. A lot of the things that I'd written down for myself, I had to check them off. Eve took care of half my list. So I will offer, I think, some reflections. In the portion of the essay that I wrote, I was really drawn by the report's connection between racial inequality, the level of racial inequality, and the black population loss. And I think intuitively we've thought about that, and some have even referenced it, but I hadn't seen anyone really kind of take some of the steps that were taken in this report to kind of really kind of draw a link to that. And like Eve said, this topic has really fascinated me for a long period of time, and one of the reasons why is I thought about where black people left in the kind of numbers that they've left in Chicago, and the two places I thought of immediately were New Orleans and Detroit. And I'm like, so you have an economic catastrophe in one city, and you have an environmental catastrophe in the other city. Like, what the hell happened in Chicago? And we didn't have something that I think you could say, this is when it happened. I think you've heard probably every single one of the little things that have happened over the last 25 years because the panel has really touched on them all. We got to do this again. This was very entertaining and informative, really energetic. I love the conversation. But Chicago has literally become, there has been like an assault on black people and black communities in this city. And the migration numbers, to me, suggest exactly that. Like something is happening. And so my hope in my essay was to say, I hope this report is a call to action, that this is finally a statement that is made that says, Chicago, wake up. Something is happening. We as a city, as a community, a collective city and collective community, are doing something to these communities that are literally driving people away. And I do think we need a wake-up call. I think back to a conversation I had with a very notable editor here in Chicago. Okay, it was a job interview. And he asked me, so what do you think is the story, the big story that's not being told in Chicago? And I said, without flinching, race. I mean, race. And he said, really? Still? And I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm not getting this job. But I thought, yeah, unquestionably. And I felt, well, I didn't need to be validated, but a few months later, the Laquan McDonald video came out, and I was kind of like, okay, all right, so, hey, this dude was really not with it. But I do think Chicago needs to be slapped in the face, and it needs to be made apparent. We still have a tremendous issue with race. And it's certainly clear, I think, to the panelists, and it's certainly been clear to me, and I would imagine it's certainly clear to many of you, that this has been the case in the city for a long period of time. And so my hope is that this report finally is a wake-up call, and not just that things have been bad, and that, yes, there is structural racism, yes, there have been deficits from the contract buying to all other things, redlining, and you name it, that have happened and have decimated black communities, have really impacted black communities. But there are things that are happening right now, things that have happened in our recent memory, things that are going to continue to happen that exacerbate those things. And my hope is that we wake up and we realize that this is a continuing story and we're just adding chapters to it. Just adding chapters to it. I think about the conversations around Lincoln Yards in the 78, right? And this is the thing that really jumps out at me about that narrative. Here we have places that are paying millions of dollars into a fund that will help support economic development and affordable housing in other parts of the city because they don't want to build it on site. And we're like, okay, that's cool. The city is looking at that going, pat on the back. We're doing something about this, right? We're making things happen. In the same breath, they are approving millions of dollars for development and affordable housing in other parts of the city. And they're approving billions of dollars in tax incentives and structural infrastructure improvements to help bring those developments. So you got billions on one end and you got millions on the other, and people walk away from the table and think like they've done a good thing. And if that is our philosophy, if that is our takeaway, then yeah, we're going to have this IRPP stay around for another 100 years because we'll have another report to talk about at that point about how this continuing legacy has kept going. So my hope is that people take this report, they take the powerful words that are coming from the people on this stage, the powerful discussion that I think we are yet to have here this morning, and they say to themselves, finally, let's do something about this. And we can't erase what's already happened, but damn, we don't have to keep it going, do we? I mean, like, come on. So, as a journalist, forgive me for my moment of stepping out of that role and being a human being. But it's a pleasure to see the room filled and people excited and energetic about this topic. And in the spirit of what Barbara said, you know, the city of activism, let's get active. Let's make something happen. Thanks so much.
Yeah, there we go. Join me in thanking these panelists once again. That was really amazing. So we will have only about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I want to remind you that for those of you who'd like to dig in further, we will have an event in February on the 26th, thank you, at UCAN on the west side, which we invite you all to. If you have questions, though, raise the cards. We haven't gotten. I'm going to start the panelists off because one of the first questions we always get, and I'm very happy to hand it off to the panelists to tackle this one. And it really speaks to the idea that these challenges are not surmountable. They're actually things that we're doing now that we shouldn't be doing and other things that we should be doing. So I want to just ask the panelists one at a time, you can pass the mic down, to just name one or two, we call them policies. They're not always about legislation, but things that we could immediately do to tackle this and to advance the issue. Thank you.
I think most quickly I would say reversing the fines, the structure of the fines and fees. So it's not just alleviating the burden that's already been produced for those who have incurred fines and fees, that's a definite, but also rethink our kind of punitive system in which we're, the economic burden falls disproportionately on black bodies. We have to rethink that and change that.
Okay, just one. I will repeat what I said, which is I think we need to be thinking more about job training and education. We need to put more money back. We've been disinvesting. We've been disinvesting from public education. We need to put more money back into pre-K, K through 12, and higher education.
I would say that, you know, there's incredible groups in the city working to decommodify land and housing also, and investing in other models of thinking about it, you know, drawing on our indigenous brothers and sisters, but thinking about land trusts and really seeing these things as collective commonwealth things that should not be sold off. And so that would be the one thing.
Okay. So I think that to Barbara's point, there are lots of organizations and individuals in the city already working on these issues, and I think that folks who want to get involved in this should reach out to those who are already and have already been deeply invested in this work to see how to be of most help. On a funding side, to your point, Teresa, I think that there's a need for a social movement to demand a redistribution of wealth, and a need for a social movement, again, not just something that can happen in government or in various institutions, and I'll speak for education because that's where I'm located, specifically to ask for more funding in these areas, right? Like I was at a public meeting last night about the budget for Chicago public schools. Our budget is 66%, 65% of adequacy up to the state of Illinois' own measure of what it should be. That's $2 billion every year that our children are entitled to and deserve that they don't get. And that can't be fixed by, and I'm also on the Board of Education, I'm not gonna hide that. That can't be fixed by me as some individual board member. That can't be fixed by certain particular individuals in spaces. That requires a social movement that I'm happy to be a part of to demand the resources that our communities need. And I think that we also need to get clear on and it's not gonna be shared, but a commitment to a definition of equity. And I say that it's not going to be shared for the point that I made earlier. There is not a shared vision of that amongst different parts of this city, but it is important to emphasize and to maintain that what equity means is looking at these communities that have been historically wronged and providing investments in consultation with those who actually live there about what that money should be used for, what that money can be used for, and then a demand for that money. The city is not a non-wealthy space. This is a wealthy city, and the way our funds are distributed is highly inequitable, and it will not be popular amongst all parts of the city to say that, but we have to continue to say that and emphasize it unapologetically.
Yes. Picking up directly on that theme of money, from 2011 to 2018, the city of Chicago spent over $500 million with a B dollars on police settlements. So I really don't want to hear that we don't have money for things when we have money to continue to deny what the Department of Justice has said, which is that the Chicago Police Department has an embedded culture of inequality, an embedded culture of harming our vulnerable communities. And so we're spending money on that rather than acknowledging it. And while those families deserve those settlements and much more, that is a terrible, terrible use of our resources. And so what are we doing to really end that culture in the police department so we can redistribute some of that? Again, $500 million in 8 years.
Something super quick. Developers in Chicago actually have a waiver that they can use, that they pay the city not to have affordable housing. And I think if we talk about equity, one of the things would be the elimination of that waiver to developers. Right? I think that's critical, and that's something immediately that can be done, but the incentives, i.e. corruption, disallow that, but I think that's something that should always be on the table, because remember, when Harold Washington, the day he passed away, he had an affordable housing ordinance that was at 50%. So any building over 6 units was supposed to be 50% affordable housing, right? So this thing around the vision just has to be there to enact that thing. And to what Elizabeth said, to be prepared for not if they come, but when they come.
Well, ditto times 6 to all these comments. And I also want us to think, I know we're focused on Chicago today, but the other thing I would say we need to do is to look at the bigger picture, right? Not only of migration and displacement and abandonment. There's 65 million people that have been forced from their homes around the world because of war, because of racism, because of the ravages of capitalism, to be blunt. So to frame it in that larger context, but also to look at other cities and organizing that's going on in other cities, policy initiatives that are going on in other cities, electoral justice work that's going on in other cities. And I will just use the mic to make a quick plug for a national effort that's happening in Washington, D.C. on February 7th, which is being organized by a coalition called the Rising Majority, of which a number of Chicago groups are a part, a number of Chicago organizers will be there, and it's talking about the connection between movement building, policy, and electoral work. And the so-called squad, the 4 most progressive women in Congress right now, are going to be at that event talking about this with organizers from all over the country. And what we're calling people to do is to squad up. That means to organize, and to organize outside of some of our places of employment. I'm just curious how many people are here as a part of their sort of day gig, right? That's why you can be here at this time of day. But we also have to self-organize. We have to organize outside of the institutions that will put constraints on that organizing, and that's very important. So, what is often called civic engagement or just plain old grassroots organizing is really part of the ingredient that's going to make a change.
Again, I'll try to be quick. Everything has been covered. Dave stole my idea this time. But the thing I'll say is that there's another aspect of migration that isn't necessarily covered in the report, but I think it's important for us to think about with regard to Black people and Black communities. So I'm a part of the migration story. I didn't move out of Chicago, but I left Auburn Gresham, the community where I spent most of my childhood, as a homeowner, and became a renter in Bronzeville because my home in Auburn Gresham, despite the new roof, the new windows, and the new screen doors and everything else that we put, the central air that we put in the home, my home lost $90,000 in value, and we walked away from the home. And so if we are going to retain Black middle class in this city, we may need to do a little extra. And so what policies can we do to help people who essentially do the right things, but because of market pressures and other things, it doesn't bear out and pan out for them? How can we keep those people whole so they can still have a good experience being particularly a homeowner in Chicago?
So we're going to start answering some of the questions that we have, and I think Alden's point is relevant to the question I have in my hand, which I'm going to just read it, and it's kind of two parts. So one, as we look at the exit, is this only limited to low-income blacks? Where is the middle-class black people? Where are the middle-class black people? And then also, I think as it connects to Alden's point, which is why does value and investment in communities only happen when white people move in? And the reason I connect that to Alden's point is because in I think the empirical evidence shows that it's not just low income. It is also middle-class blacks, but it's also how we define low income and middle class, right? That's an ambiguity in the category. So yes, both are moving, and often the poorest can't move. Right, so you'll see that often there are poor people that remain in place unless they're pushed, relocated, but they don't often have the resources to just easily move. But in terms of capital attached to white bodies and not black bodies, and so when you have black spaces, they've been disinvested, they've been underinvested by capitalism. And so what happened to Alden is an experience that many people have experienced, that many black families have experienced in terms of the loss of value in their home. And it's to answer the question of why is that? I mean, that's part of the structural racism story we've been telling. Why is value attached to whiteness in a way that it's not attached to blackness? So in disproportionately black neighborhoods, with the same architecture, the same vernacular, the value of those properties will be significantly less on the south side relative to the north side, right? So then the real question is, how do we change that? Right? How do we make it such that our properties are equally valued without making it such that people can't afford to remain in place? That's the challenge. There is indeed a conundrum and a contradiction there. How do we maintain the value and the integrity of our properties at the same time we don't inflate the value such that people that are living there? There are mechanisms. As a planner policy person, I think about some of those mechanisms and the safety nets that are required, but we also have a council that just voted against community benefit agreements, right? So that people can no longer, or the ordinance, so that people that are in place in Woodlawn, and they're going to see this huge inflation in their property values because of the Obama library, right, or whatever they're calling it. And that's a problem. We should protect people in place. We should allow people to remain. We should allow people to return home. But that's not what we're valuing. We value property at this point.
Or we have the next question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, so this is a policy question that is very near and dear to my heart. The question is, with the promises of the CTU strike, including a rise in prospective employment in public service, hopefully in ways that benefit black students in Chicago, what would the city have to do to make sure a substantial portion of those positions go to black Chicagoans? So I think part of this is in the context of the larger decline in the black teaching force. So in 1984, black teachers outnumbered white teachers for the first time in the history of the city. This year, black teachers are in and around 21% of the teaching force. And there's a number of reasons for this. But the fact that it's a problem, and I guess I want to say this too, is not lost on folks within Chicago public schools. Like, I think they're very clear this is a problem. It's part of the priorities of the district to address this problem. And so most recently in my role as a board member, one of the things we did is have a community meeting about this topic, and particularly thinking about pipeline issues. There are a number of things that need to happen, both sort of community-based solutions to this issue, programs like Grow Your Own, better work with universities, and I'm looking at us, higher education in the room. We do not do a good job of recruiting and retaining a diverse teacher education program and teacher education force, so we have a role as higher education to play in this. Certainly, Chicago Public Schools has a number of different programs that teacher residency programs, the expansion of career and technical education that has a teacher prep component to it. But I say all of this, part of the purpose of having this community meeting is that I think the district also recognizes, and this is part of what I was trying to facilitate with this, that we need more information from communities. And so currently, we're actually processing some of the information from that community meeting to impact the direction that district policy takes going forward. So if this is an area of interest for you, and that meeting was just about pipeline, there's a whole nother set of issues around retention, because you can pump as many Black teachers as you want into the system. If you're not retaining them, then what are we doing? So that's a whole nother set of issues to be addressed. But if this is an issue that you are interested in, please come see me, because we need more hands on deck on this, not less. But I do want to, again, reemphasize this is both a priority for me and a priority within the 5-year vision for the district. So I think this is an opportunity to capitalize on that confluence to try to push this forward.
And I apologize, we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. But our panelists will be around for a few minutes. So go ahead, thanks.
No pressure on the final question. So this person wrote, according to page 27, Westtown and Logan Square, close reader, Westtown and Logan Square have a large amounts of white increase and Black decrease. What are the ways these areas and other areas generally are incentivizing white people and disincentivizing Black people to live there? Why these areas? And they wrote an encouraging note, so thank you to that person. So I grew up in Logan Square, so this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I grew up with almost entirely Mexican and Puerto Rican neighbors as one of the few kind of Black African-American families in the neighborhood. And when I was a child, my father lived in Pilsen. So these two communities, I think, are really similar in that sociologist Robert Sampson and his research team out of Harvard have pointed out that some of the reason we see what we might more traditionally refer to as gentrification in places like Logan Square, in places like Pilsen, and not in places like Inglewood is because the specific way that anti-Black racism resonates allows new white newcomers to the city to kind of engage in the same kind of commodification of Latinx culture, right, in a way that feels proximal and feels exciting and feels fun and cool, that they're not necessarily willing to do in Black communities, but the displacement is the same, right? And so for me, the question becomes, how do we create moments of solidarity between communities like in Logan Square and Pilsen and Little Village, where people have been fighting really hard against displacement and also predicted a lot of it, right? They said, if you put the 606 in, this will happen, right? And so how do we, as some of the people in the room that are policymakers, really listen to communities so that we can not just, be sad and surprised after the displacement happens, but how, from an organizing perspective, how can we build solidarities between communities to say some aspects of our struggle may be different, but we are getting pushed out of the city in different ways. And I also want to close by really asking white Chicagoans, because I opened by talking about settler colonialism. If you move into a space and your perspective is that you own the space because you showed up, that's something you really need to think about. Right? And so I really want to ask white Chicagoans to be reflective about what kind of neighbors you are in these spaces. What are your commitments to the people that are already there, who have been there for generations, who really don't have other places to go, who can't decide tomorrow that some other place is trendy and just up and move because that costs thousands of dollars to do that, right? So I want to ask you what your commitments are to being a good neighbor, to being a good steward, to being a good partner in communities where you are a newcomer. And that is not a question any of us can answer that for you, but I hope that folks are willing to ask themselves that difficult reflective work.
I just want to conclude by, again, thanking our panelists, but also thanking all of you. We can't do this work without you. We appreciate your collaboration. We appreciate your partnership. We appreciate you making time for this conversation. We hope you'll push it forward, continue it on in all the spaces that you're going to be, and please join us again next time. Thanks very much.